His son, John Stuart Mill, who was born in 1808, carried on a somewhat softened form of the Benthamite doctrine to the time of his death in 1873. Throughout the middle portion of the 19th century, the influence of the Benthamites on British legislation and policy was astonishingly great, considering their complete absence of emotional appeal. Bentham advanced various arguments in favor of the view that the general happiness is the summum bonum. Some of these arguments were acute criticisms of other ethical theories. In his treatise on political sophisms, he says, in language which seems to anticipate Marx, that sentimental and ascetic moralities serve the interests of the governing class and are the product of an aristocratic regime. Those who teach the morality of sacrifice, he continues, are not victims of error. They want others to sacrifice to them. The moral order, he says, results from equilibrium of interests. Governing corporations pretend that there is already identity of interests between the governors and the governed, but reformers make it clear that this identity does not yet exist and try to bring it about. He maintains that only the principle of utility can give a criterion in morals and legislation and lay the foundation of a social science. His main positive argument in favor of his principle is that it is really implied by apparently different ethical systems. This, however, is only made plausible by a severe restriction of his survey. There is an obvious lacuna in Bentham's system. If every man always pursues his own pleasure, how are we to secure that the legislator shall pursue the pleasure of mankind in general? Bentham's own instinctive benevolence, which his psychological theories prevented him from noticing, concealed the problem from him. If he had been employed to draw up a code of laws for some country, he would have framed his proposals in what he conceived to be the public interest, not so as to further his own interests or, consciously, the interests of his class. But if he had recognized this fact, he would have had to modify his psychological doctrines. He seems to have thought that, by means of democracy combined with adequate supervision, legislators could be so controlled that they could only further their private interests by being useful to the general public. There was in his day not much material for forming a judgment as to the working of democratic institutions, and his optimism was therefore perhaps excusable. But in our more disillusioned age it seems somewhat naive. John Stuart Mill, in his Utilitarianism, offers an argument which is so fallacious that it is hard to understand how he can have thought it valid. He says, "Pleasure is the only thing desired. Therefore, pleasure is the only thing desirable." He argues that the only things visible are things seen, the only things audible are things heard, and similarly, the only things desirable are things desired. He does not notice that a thing is visible if it can be seen, but desirable if it ought to be desired. Thus, desirable is a word presupposing an ethical theory. We cannot infer what is desirable from what is desired. Again, if each man in fact and inevitably pursues his own pleasure, there is no point in saying he ought to do something else. Kant urged that you ought implies you can. Conversely, if you cannot, it is futile to say you ought. If each man must always pursue his own pleasure, ethics is reduced to prudence. You may do well to further the interests of others in the hope that they in turn will further yours. Similarly, in politics, all cooperation is a matter of log-rolling. From the premises of the Utilitarians, no other conclusion is validly deducible. There are two distinct questions involved. First, does each man pursue his own happiness? Second, is the general happiness the right end of human action? When it is said that each man desires his own happiness, the statement is capable of two meanings, of which one is a truism and the other is false. Whatever I may happen to desire, I shall get some pleasure from achieving my wish. In this sense, whatever I desire is a pleasure, and it may be said, though somewhat loosely, that pleasures are what I desire. This is the sense of the doctrine which is a truism. But if what is meant is that when I desire anything, I desire it because of the pleasure that it will give me, that is usually untrue. When I am hungry, I desire food, and so long as my hunger persists, food will give me pleasure. But the hunger, which is a desire, comes first. The pleasure is a consequence of the desire. I do not deny that there are occasions when there is a direct desire for pleasure. If you have decided to devote a free evening to the theatre, you will choose the theatre that you think will give you the most pleasure. but the actions thus determined by the direct desire for pleasure are exceptional and unimportant. Everybody's main activities are determined by desires which are anterior to the calculation of pleasures and pains. Anything whatever may be an object of desire. A masochist may desire his own pain. The masochist, no doubt, derives pleasure from the pain that he has desired, but the pleasure is because of the desire, not vice versa. A man may desire something that does not affect him personally, except because of his desire, for instance, the victory of one side in a war in which his country is neutral. He may desire an increase of general happiness or a mitigation of general suffering. Or he may, like Carlyle, desire the exact opposite. As his desires vary, so do his pleasures. Ethics is necessary because men's desires conflict. The primary cause of conflict is egoism. Most people are more interested in their own welfare than in that of other people. But conflicts are equally possible where there is no element of egoism. One man may wish everybody to be Catholic. Another may wish everybody to be Calvinist. Such non-egoistic desires are frequently involved in social conflicts. Ethics has a twofold purpose. First, to find a criterion by which to distinguish good and bad desires. Second, by means of praise and blame, to promote good desires and discourage such as are bad. The ethical part of the utilitarian doctrine, which is logically independent of the psychological part, says, those desires and those actions are good which in fact promote the general happiness. This need not be the intention of an action, but only its effect. Is there any valid theoretical argument either for or against this doctrine? We found ourselves faced with a similar question in relation to Nietzsche. His ethic differs from that of the utilitarians, since it holds that only a minority of the human race have ethical importance. The happiness or unhappiness of the remainder should be ignored. I do not myself believe that this disagreement can be dealt with by theoretical arguments such as might be used in a scientific question. Obviously, those who are excluded from the Nietzschean aristocracy will object, and thus the issue becomes political rather than theoretical. The utilitarian ethic is democratic and anti-romantic. Democrats are likely to accept it, but those who like a more Byronic view of the world can, in my opinion, be refuted only practically, not by considerations which appeal only to facts as opposed to desires.